Get this sense of joking because it's almost like a relief from the stress to do that. And this is the human factor of combat that he's reporting on. It's so important for people to understand.
Let's talk about that human factor a little bit, and we want Walter Rogers to stay with us as long as you can as General Grange is talking. Take us inside that Bradley fighting vehicle that we are looking at and have been looking at now for several minutes. The pictures can only tell so much. Tell us a little bit about, as you're sitting in that thing, as you are looking out, as the sand is surrounding you, you're not sure where you're going, you're not sure who's on either side of you. What is that like?
Okay, that's a great point, and that well-deserving explanation, because we're looking at a hunk of steel. We're looking at not a human piece of equipment. The human factor of this. So we're going to take you inside of that thing. First of all, in there you have a guy driving this vehicle that is very tired. These people have been up for days, very tired. He's exhilarated, he's got that surge of energy, so he's alert, but he has this still tired after days and days. Soldiers never get enough sleep. You're always tired. Second, you got a vehicle commander that his head is out of the hatch or it's in the hatch depending on enemy fire, but he'll come in and out of that thing.
And you can see him right now.
Yeah,
is that him?
Because he wants situational awareness. Inside they have great equipment to see in the night, the day, but he wants situational awareness. And he wants to smell, he wants to hear, he wants to see the battlefield.
And that would be frightening because there's sniper fire going on.
There's fire going on, but still, to save his vehicle, to save his troopers, he'll do that to get that situational awareness. The other thing is you have a gunner. He's working this 25 millimeter Bushmaster cannon, a very devastating weapon. Not like as big as a tank round, but it'll go through most of the stuff the Iraqis have out there. It's a tremendous weapon.
And are they communicating with each other via radio? Are they just
internal
talking? Are they yelling? Are they?
No, they're talking on intercom to each other inside the Bradley. And then they have the 7.62 machine gun. You've heard that as well. On the tank, it's called a coax. It's a 7.62 machine gun as well. And they also fire TOWs, a missile to take out tanks.
Right.
So there's a lot of firepower in those vehicles. And in the back, you have 2 to 3 scouts. Depends. There may be more in there. I don't know. But when you get to a thing like an objective like the bridge, they would get out to do the searching of the bridge of explosives. Ugh. They're the ones that say this bridge can carry a tank. This bridge cannot carry a tank. We need to go to another bridge. They're the ones that may get out and look for a sniper in a ditch.
So how cramped is it inside that?
It gets cramped because when you put all your equipment, now you see a lot of stuff hung on the outside of the Bradley fighting vehicle. It's it's an infantry fighting vehicle. This version is for scouts. It's called the M3 instead of the M2. But it does get cramped. Water, food, ammunition, a lot of extra ammunition.
And they've been together in there for a very long time. We're just seeing like the tip of the spear here. What does it look like behind Walter, behind that first tank that we're seeing?
I'm hoping a tank or another Bradley behind Walter is what I hope.
And I'm sure Walter Rogers is hoping that as well. He joins us again live on the phone while this is going on. Walter, we've been continuing to look at your just extraordinary pictures. Give us, General Grange was talking a little bit about the human element, which so much of this comes down to. So much of what happens on a battlefield comes down to what is in the mind and the heart of the soldiers and the Marines and the airmen who are fighting. Tell us a little bit about what you have experienced, what you have heard from the others in the 7th Cavalry, about their mood, about their morale, and about what they see ahead of them.
I will, Anderson, but first let me give you an idea. I think you've been looking at pictures of the terrain here. We're now going through an Iraqi farming village, and behind any one of those buildings could be an Iraqi soldier with an RPG ready to shoot out at the convoy you now see in front of you. On any one of those building roofs, you could have someone with a Kalashnikov rifle. We experienced that very same sort of ambush and screening yesterday morning when we were looking for a roof route around Al-Samawa, and it was found to be impossible because the Iraqis were screening screening the civilians, using them as a kind of protection, banking that the Army would not fire on civilian dwellings. Last night in our firefight, and this is an important point to bring up, last night in our firefight, as we were driving along, it was total darkness, pitch black, not even starlight, because the sandstorm was moving in, and there was a haze in the darkness.
Oh wait, Walter.
Suddenly, one of the
We just passed some civilians. That's what they looked like. I just wondered if you'd seen them, Walter.
Yes, we've seen them along the way. Let me continue, because this is a story which involves civilians. There was fire coming at the column last night as we were approaching one of the canal bridges, heavy fire, and it came from a civilian building. Of course, under those circumstances, the Army's convoy has permission to return fire. It did. I have since heard that what happened was an Iraqi soldier moved into a civilian dwelling to shoot at the convoy. There were children in there, and of course the convoy had no way of knowing that, but one soldier told me this morning that he had heard that when the convoy returned fire, it resulted in the collapse of a wall, killing 2 small Iraqi children inside. But here again, this was the direct consequence of the Iraqis taking up position in civilian dwellings. Anderson, Carol?
Walter, and you were talking about those A-10 Warthogs that earlier foiled an Iraqi ambush. What was... When something like when the Warthog, comes into play, when it arrives on the scene, what goes through the minds of the people on the ground, or at least what are they saying to you? Is there a sense of excitement, a sense of relief that they are getting the close air support?
That's an excellent description of it, Anderson. And I was, under fire last night, and when everyone saw that Warthog coming in, and it lets out a loud belch when the Gatling gun comes off, and then you see forward of it, and all of a sudden it just chews up the whole ground. It's like a magnificent fireworks display, and of course anything there is going to be destroyed. And the fires were burning where the Warthogs hit for at least an hour or more afterwards, and there were whole patches of fire, fields of fire out beyond the convoy where the Warthog had strafed with that Gatling gun.
General Grange?
You had asked earlier, Anderson, about the move.
Go ahead, Walter.
You had asked earlier about the troops. What we have seen here is these soldiers sort of pitting themselves in combat and feeling rather pleased with themselves that they didn't flinch. Every one of them admitted that he was scared, and any intelligent soldier would admit that he was scared. But they survived the challenge of fear. They fired their guns. The column maintained its position, and it punched on through. So they were very pleased with themselves in that sense. And anyone who's ever been in combat will recognize this feeling. But each of them had his own hair-raising tale to tell. One was bragging about the machine gunner, actually an Air Force enlisted man who was flying in the Tactical Air Command Post, which is to say the armored vehicle which calls in the airstrikes, and they were bragging about him because he was up there with his 50 caliber machine gun in the dark, very little armor around him as he was outside the turret, and he was banging away the whole time. I went up to the machine gunner at the from the Air Force Tactical Air Command vehicle, and I said to him, "How'd you do last night?" And he held up 3 fingers, meaning he killed 3 of the Iraqis.
General,
Anderson?
you had a comment.
Yeah, Walter's brought up 3 great points real briefly. One, talking about the combat air controller who calls in the airstrikes in support of this Calvary unit is a great example of individual jointness on the battlefield. The relationship between, in this case, the Air Force and the Army with this unit. And then the ability to participate in the situation as it's encountered. In other words, here's a firefight, small arms, the guy's job is working radios, calling in airstrikes. Yet, he grabbed the machine gun because he's part of this unit, he's part of this team, and he feels that, and that's very important. The other thing he talked about is the feeling of the A-10 coming in and expending ammunition on any positions. There's a couple things, sights and sounds, that someone in combat loves. One is close air support. when you bring in the close air support and you hear it crackling on the radio, that the guy's call sign, this is Bandit 2 coming in hot, and you hear the rounds leaving the aircraft and then impacting on the ground or an enemy target, the sense of relief, the sense of power that your force is applying and its protection and support of you is just it's so relieving. It just really it's great. I can tell you that.
And you know, you've been in quite a few of those situations.
A few of those. And the other is that we haven't talked about, and maybe Walter has a story or two. And the other site, and someone you always want around you, is the medics. You know, the medical personnel. In Vietnam, they call them the boxy. That's for Vietnamese for the doctor. You always hear in movies that medic. You always hear those stories, and you want those guys around you because if you're hurt or something happens to you or one of your friends, they're very important people.
Okay, Walter, comment on that aspect of this operation.
The medic.
Well, the general is absolutely right, but then generals always are. But let me add this. When I saw those A-10s coming in, when I saw the A-10s coming in chewing up the ground, my one-word answer was amen. Every one of us was extraordinarily relieved because imagine looking out into total darkness in an agricultural area. You can't see more than 40 or 50 meters without night vision goggles, and you know there are people out there. We had no idea how many people were out there, but it turned out to be several hundred, 300-400 Iraqi dismounts. That's infantry soldiers were out there shooting at the 7th Cavalry's convoy last night. So they were more than pleased with that. What was your other point, General?
Well, did you have any experiences yet on medics, the use of medical personnel to support any of your people?
Well, lest I wax theological, before the chaplain gave us his best wishes several days ago before we crossed from Kuwait into Iraq, the chaplain, Steve Balog, an Episcopal minister, told a very large volunteer audience, God is watching over you. And until this last skirmish, this unit has been extraordinarily fortunate. The only injury has been one soldier who had a hatch close, Bradley hatch close on his hand. Unless we took something in the past half hour, which we haven't had a chance to check on, there have been no wounded. And this convoy is extraordinarily fortunate, moving through hostile territory, encountering hostile forces, while the tanks and the Bradleys have the advantage of firepower and air support. You have to remember that the enemy always has a vote on the battlefield, and that's what we're seeing here today. The Iraqis are running up, taking advantage of the sandstorm, dashing up, firing in the direction of the convoy. Again, we don't know whether anyone was hit. They haven't fired much big that could take out a Bradley or a tank this morning. That is the largest thing we've heard coming in the direction of the convoy was mortars, but they were falling very close to us. One just after we got off the Euphrates River crossing bridge, there were mortar fragments flying upwards into the palm fronds above, and it sounded like rain, except it wasn't coming down, it was going up. So this is still a dodgy situation. Gerald Anderson?
Yeah, Walter, one thing you said there, I think it's important for everybody to understand that regardless of the weather that your force that you're participating in, regardless of that weather, the word mutual support, I can assure you, and I'm sure that you feel this way now that you've been embedded in that unit for so long, that regardless of that weather, if the situation gets grim, because of the feeling of mutual support, that if pilots are asked to provide anything to you in those conditions, they'll be there, and you know that.
Well, that's true, General. The only problem is that the sandstorm has enabled the Iraqi snipers to get closer to the road than they normally would be. And in fact, if the Air Force were called in, they would be strafing close to our position on the road even as we move along, simply because the sandstorm is acting as a smoke screen, which is giving the Iraqis a fair amount of tactical advantage, at least in terms of small arms fire.
No, I understand
Anderson?
that. And again, the snipers of course, the snipers and anybody in close like that. But I'm talking about if you encounter a larger force, they have other capabilities to drop stuff on those and take them down. And you also used a great a phrase that they use in military war fighters all the time. You're really getting into this stuff when you said the enemy has a vote. You're starting to really pick up some of these key phrases that all the military leadership uses in combat.
What do they mean by that?
Let me interrupt everyone for just a second to do a time check. It's 6:30 Eastern Time. If you're just joining us, and we want to tell our viewers what's happening right now, you're taking a look at the 7th Cavalry. They're in central Iraq now. The important thing to keep in mind here is that they have finally been able to cross the Euphrates River using one of those bridges. The bridges was loaded heavily with explosives, but yet they're on their way towards Baghdad, we presume. As you can see, a sandstorm going on right now, which is making things rather dangerous for the troops. And Walter, I wanted to talk too about this surreal nature of passing through, I know, what essentially are neighborhoods on the way to Baghdad.
Well, I think you find that almost in any war now. It was certainly the case in Vietnam. It was certainly the case in the Middle East, all of the Middle Eastern wars I've covered. Certainly the case in Chechnya. Increasingly, you find that the hostile forces will seek cover, seek protection, use civilian populations to screen their own maneuvers and to give themselves some shield from the larger firepower, in this case of the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry. But you do see problems with the civilian population. Let me give you an example. We were going through a village late last night. An elderly Arab came out in one of his long dresses, and he is said to have had a rifle in his hands, and he started waving at the soldiers. Now, you have to ask yourself, and this is what every soldier who saw him was confronted with. Here you have a man appearing to be friendly. He's got a rifle in his hands. Is he the village elder saying, "Here, follow me, I'll show you a way through the village"? Or is he someone who's sympathetic to the Iraqi regime in Baghdad saying, "Here, follow me, I'm going to lead you into an ambush"? This is a very, very complicated situation, and every soldier with his finger on a trigger has to make instantaneous and wise and correct decisions. Otherwise, we face tragedies all along this road.
So, Walter, what
Anderson?
happened to the elderly man then who was waving the rifle?
I got that story from soldiers forward in the column. I do not believe he was fired upon. I also am sure he was not followed. It's just one of those situations where you don't know. I had a situation yesterday morning where a young Iraqi fellow comes up to me and starts saying hello, and I spoke to him in a few phrases of Arabic. He spoke back to me and said, "I speak English." I chatted him up. He wanted to denounce Saddam Hussein to me. He denounced Saddam right and left, and of course, as a reporter, you don't know whether he's telling the truth or not. And then he wanted to go over to a Bradley fighting vehicle just a few meters away, like 20 meters away, and I prevented him physically from going over there because I knew if he approached the vehicle, he was going to be told to stop, and if he kept approaching, he would be shot, because Saddam Hussein has said he will use suicide bombers to stop the Americans. I didn't put my hands on the guy's hip to see if he had dynamite, but that was a very real possibility. Was this young Arab civilian anything more or less than he appeared to be? I can tell you that within seconds after that, probably less than 5 minutes actually, within less than 5 minutes after that, suddenly they were firing on us. The Iraqi army irregulars were firing on our column with rocket-propelled grenades, small arms fire. We dived to our vehicle and drove away. This is a situation you encounter in almost any conflict anywhere in the world now. Certainly the Russians are encountering this in Chechnya. You just don't know whether these civilians are what they appear to be or not.
Yeah, and the other thing we've been seeing, Walter, as you're bringing us these extraordinary pictures, a short time ago we were actually seeing civilian vehicles passing the other way because you're literally on a roadway through central Iraq.
Well, that's true, but this is their highway. Having said that, this is also the highway the 7th Cavalry has elected to use as it punches north of the Euphrates River in the general direction of Baghdad. Having said that, there are many Iraqis who normally would be driving this road, or a few because there's a sandstorm, but there have been a few civilian vehicles, and they just drive blithely by with their lights on because it is a sandstorm, and it's up to the individuals in each of those Bradley fighting vehicles vehicles and tanks to make a prudent and calculated decision as to whether these civilians are what they appear to be, or whether they're a hostile force using a civilian car to get close and take a couple shots at the cavalry. Carol, Anderson?
Walter, it's Anderson. I want to just mention something. CNN's Gary Stryker, who is embedded with troops on the USS Roosevelt, was reporting earlier that there's going to be something of a shift in the use of aircraft so far, sort of moving away from bombing missions and more into flying into air interdiction zones and providing that close air support to ground troops that we had been talking about just a short time ago. And I'm interested to know, actually, from General Grange, if that is in fact the case, if we're going to be seeing less sort of bombing runs and more taking out targets of opportunity, close air support of troops, do you think is it fair to say that is because they no longer are finding that they have already hit the positions they had wanted to, or that something has shifted in the military campaign, in the military strategy, that they feel now, okay, it's more important to go to close air support?
Yeah, they're going to continue to hit the operational level targets. In other words, ministries of defense, airfields, those type of things if need be. But these targets of opportunity, what that means is as things are reported on the battlefield, either from the Calvary unit that we're watching right here, or other units, or let's say a Predator, or signals intercept, or whatever the case may be, these orbiting strike aircraft will then swoop in and hit those targets that emerge on a battlefield as it's developing. So that's the targets of opportunity.
So in a sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, General Grange, there will be at all times planes just sort of flying around, I guess, in these air interdiction zones, who can be called upon at any time by the people traveling with Walter, by the Air Force liaison officer who calls in the close air support, and they leave their interdiction zone and just go in for the attack.
They're planes interdicting targets of maybe enemy forces moving, but the close air support package is up there right now. Walter might not know that, maybe he does, but it's up there. And if they're needed and they can get in, and like he said, the sandstorm may negate using 30 millimeter strafing runs, but they may be able to drop a bomb on, let's say, buildings in a village that he passes through that they're taking fire from, as an example, or the far side of a bridge. They can do that on a moment's notice.
Now, Walter, just for the viewers, both here in the United States and internationally who are watching this, you are in a Humvee. You're shooting, the cameraman is shooting outside, I imagine, the front windshield of the Humvee. That's a Bradley fighting vehicle ahead of you. You have been moving really nonstop, though we have sporadically been hearing small arms fire from either side of the road. Tell us just a little bit, Walter. It seems that whatever small arms fire you are encountering, it does not seem to be stopping the forward movement of the 7th Cavalry.
It doesn't, but as we have been pointing out all morning in this broadcast, there are Iraqi civilian vehicles traveling on the other side of the road. And I should point out that while the cavalry is traveling northward on a deliberate pace, the Iraqi civilian vehicles, hearing those small arms shots, that is AK-47s and perhaps light machine guns, they're driving like 60 to get out of the way, because imagine driving down a highway and knowing people are shooting across that highway at the 7th Cavalry's convoy. Again, it has not slowed the progress of the convoy. In a situation like this, there isn't much you can do except go forward, at least under these weather conditions. If I might add something to what General Grange was saying on Gary Stryker's comments, what Gary is describing is precisely what we anticipate will happen. That is to say, a different bombing function for the Air Force and Navy jets, which will be flying these missions. The reason being that as the Army and the Marines and other units push further towards Baghdad, the Iraqi forces, particularly the Republican Guard, will draw in a tighter circle. Those are extraordinarily professional soldiers, and it's going to be a force-on-force situation in which this armor goes up against the Iraqi armor. Those are very professional soldiers. They're capable of putting up a very, very good fight, and the Air Force, the Navy jets as well, are all going to be needed to punish those Iraqi divisions which are dug in at this point. Anderson?
Walter,
Carol?
this is Carol Costello talking to you again. I think that maybe this is the appropriate time to talk about this supposed red line around Baghdad as you're racing ever faster towards that. Can you tell us at all what the troops have been told about that?
I don't think the troops have been told much by way of specifics on what you call the red line around Baghdad, and I would be a little careful in describing us as racing toward Baghdad. We are moving northward in that general direction, but this is not going to be a sudden fist which appears in the face of the Iraqi units around Baghdad. Remember, this is a very coordinated attack on all fronts. We have Army brigades to our left, that is to the west. We have, I believe, Army brigades to the east and southeast. We have U.S. Marines and British forces to the southeast. This unit is not on a race to beat everyone else to Baghdad. It would never do that sort of thing. What it's doing is moving deliberately northward along a highway in the general direction of Baghdad. It is not about to knock on the gates of Baghdad, at least not just yet, because that's not its mission. It is probing ahead, looking for Iraqi strengths and weaknesses, and radioing back to the other units which may be following on. But be careful about suggesting that this unit is rolling onto Baghdad, because it isn't really quite the military situation. I can't go into more detail, but what I can say is it is moving deliberately in that direction. But remember, we have been moving in that direction for several days, and sometimes we're told to pause and stop, and we sit in an attack position and wait for other units to leapfrog around us, above us, on either side of us. The important thing is that the elements of the 7th Cavalry did indeed cross the Euphrates River this morning, and that means that Saddam's grip on southern Iraq is greatly weakened. Recall, he sent his elite troops down there, the Fedayeen commanders, plus his Republican Guard, to hold cities like An-Najaf and Al-Samawa, where we had been bogged down, and down to Nasiriyah and over to Basra. He gave orders that Euphrates River line should be held, and the 7th Cavalry has indeed punched through it. But we're still a good distance from Baghdad, and as battlefield commanders, I hope General Grange can help me on this. As any battlefield commander will tell you, he'll send a unit forward just so far, hold that, and then leapfrog other units to the east or west to move them forward, perhaps even ahead of us.
General
General Grange.
Yeah. What Walter's saying, it goes back to mutual support. You know, always, even though this is the eyes and ears of that ground force that in the west, moving north, this is the eyes and ears. They're not moving up to attack Baghdad. They're the eyes and the ears. They're always going to have mutual support from other ground units or air units.
And they cannot allow the fact that there are snipers or maybe snipers on either side of them taking shots at them. They can't allow that to stop them.
It's not effective enemy force being applied to their mission. So that's exactly right. They have a mission to go. They have certain objectives they're going to move to for that particular day or night or that phase of movement, and that'll be reported back. And so they're the eyes and ears, but it has to have a robust combat. There we see an M1 Abrams tank, and you see that this reconnaissance element also has some very robust firepower along with it.
Okay, Walter, looks like you've stopped. What's going on?
Well, this is the way we leapfrog forward, and as I say, 7th Cavalry has taken a position here. The visibility is extraordinarily poor. They're not sure of what the road condition is ahead. For the past 3/4 of an hour or more, they've taken mortar fire very close to the convoy, very close to us in our vehicle. They've taken rifle fire as well. We've all been shot at, and so they're pausing briefly now so they can assess the situation as best they can, with visibility limited to no more than 150 meters, a football field and a half.
All right.
We want to talk. We want to
Anderson?
talk more about the Abrams tank that we just mentioned, and we're going to bring the general in here to explain more about this particular tank.
Yeah, the Abrams tank, it's the best tank on the battlefield, and I'm not saying that because I'm an American citizen. It definitely is. The British have a great tank, the Chieftain, the Germans, the Leopard, but this Abrams tank, a lot of the things that are being fired at Walter's column cannot penetrate that tank. Does it have some vulnerabilities? Yes, I won't go into them. But the firing he's receiving will not hurt that tank. So right now, that's not the Abrams tank that we're looking at right there. That's a control vehicle. But the Abrams tank is nothing at the Republican Guard division where they're going to, the way where it's located, where they're headed, can stop that Abrams tank at any distance or without multiple enemy weapons against it.
Okay.
It was interesting when you were describing before about the men inside the tank and the human element of this. So describe to us what the inside of this Abrams tank looks like.
The inside of the Abrams tank is a 4-man crew. Again, you have a driver. You have a loader loading the tank ammunition. You have a tank commander in the tank as well, and you have a gunner. And so this, so it's a 4-man crew. It has a 120 millimeter tank round, which will kill any tank on a battlefield, any tank, at a greater distance than any tank on a battlefield.
All right.
Understand.
Walter, just so you know what we're going to do, we're going to let you take a breather for just a minute or so. We're going to continue on your picture on the side of the screen, but we're just going to let our viewers get an update of all the latest developments at this hour. So, Walter, we'll come back to you probably in about a minute or two. And here are the latest developments at this hour. In another location, a success for coalition forces. A British commander says the Iraqi port city of Qasr has finally been secured. He also says aid could start flowing through the port within 48 hours. Moving on to Basra, where coalition forces are changing their strategy. Senior British military officials say the city has now become a, quote, legitimate military target. They want to use the city as a point of entry for humanitarian aid. Basra residents have been without water and electricity for days. Also, staying in southern Iraq, U.S. Marines have faced intense fighting again in Nasiriyah. 2 vehicles they were using got stuck in the mud, were abandoned. 4 others were destroyed by Iraqis, and a U.S. warplane hit another vehicle. No word yet on any possible injuries. Iraq's information minister vows coalition forces are in for some shocking surprises from Iraqi fighters. In his words, he ridiculed the shock and awe bombing campaign, saying the U.S. was dropping bombs that only made a loud noise in an attempt to scare Iraqis. The official said Iraqi soldiers would turn coalition tactics against them. And that's an update of what's going on at this hour. We go back now to Walter Rogers, who is with the 7th Cavalry. We have been following Walter for over an hour, just about an hour now. Walter, what's going on where you are?
Anderson, the story remains the same here, but an important one. That story is that elements of the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry have crossed the Euphrates River within the past several hours. That means they have moved north of the Euphrates River defense line, which Saddam Hussein's forces had more or less erected. It was not an easy crossing. They tried several days ago to cross in Al-Asamwa, but they were thwarted there. That's where the 7th Cavalry got bogged down, so a diversionary route was planned. The diversionary route was taken. The Marines had to fight their way, the 7th Cavalry had to fight their way up to the canal bridges in a very forbidding firefight last night. All vehicles coming under fire, putting out great cover fire as they tried to move forward. The Air Force had to be called in. Eventually, the Iraqi ambush was quelled, and then a canal bridge crossing was made. Then this morning, the 7th Cavalry, with the help of Bone Crusher Troop, that's one of the 3 troops in this, punched across one of the Euphrates River's bridges. The engineers were called up. They discovered that the bridge had been heavily laced with explosives. The Iraqis did not have time to wire the explosives, so of course the engineers dismantled that. That enabled Apache Troop to come up, but it has been a bit of a fight the entire way. When our vehicle was coming off the bridge, we could hear mortars falling to our left. We took a sharp left turn. Another mortar fell very close to us, so close that you could hear the shrapnel from the mortar shell exploding upward into the palm fronds above it, and then small arms fire for the last hour or so, pretty much.
Walter,
Anderson?
I could interrupt you. This is Carol again. Interrupt you for just a second. We just saw a pickup truck pass that Bradley tank. It was a civilian pickup truck because, of course, they're on a roadway there, and we saw the tanks. the Bradley's, what do you call it, the gun, the turret,
Yeah.
follow that pickup truck as it went by?
Well, that's always perhaps prudent, or we don't know if he was deliberately following it. He's constantly swinging that turret in a defensive, threatening mode to anything which might threaten his vehicle. I don't know as he was actually taking aim on that pickup truck. I can tell you all these civilian vehicles we see driving down this road are driving much more quickly than normal, especially through that canyon of small arms fire through which we just passed. Every one of the drivers in the thin-skinned vehicles, bus drivers, the taxi drivers, and so forth, have been hearing that small arms fire, know that it's heading in the direction of the U.S. convoy. They also know that they're traveling down the same road, so that accelerator hits the metal real fast, and the Iraqis race on past as quickly as they can to get out of the line of fire, which has been directed at this convoy, small arms fire, snipers, and so forth, for the past hour or so. Carol? Anderson?
General, you saw what I saw. You're seeing it again. Describe in detail more of what we're seeing as civilian vehicles pass by these tanks.
Well, I think the point that, I'm glad you brought that up about the gun turret, 25 millimeter gun turret, focusing on an oncoming civilian vehicle. The gun turned. This is an example of discipline. This is an example of people not being overly excited, engaged in something that's not really a threat. And these decisions on discipline have to be made in a second or two. In other words, the troop is disciplined enough not to engage something that's not a threat, but he may not know that until the last second. And so, yes, he's ready to fire, but he's disciplined enough not to fire if he doesn't have to.
General Grange, I just want to point out to our viewers, we are going to put on the side of the screen another picture from Baghdad where sandstorms. There is also a sandstorm. We're about to bring that up. We're not going to go away from Walter Rogers. We just want to bring up to show we've lost the picture. As soon as we get it back, we'll show you apparently a sandstorm hitting Baghdad.
Nasty weather in much of Iraq, also in Nasiriyah, where an intense sandstorm and a rainstorm was going on at the same time.
General, I just want to continue with you on that discipline you talked about, General Grange. I mean, the few times I've been in sort of combat environments, the adrenaline that is pumping is extraordinary, and I suppose the more you are in it, the less that happens. But how do you learn that discipline? I mean, how do you learn? I mean, the person who is in that Bradley fighting vehicle that we are looking at right now, that Walter Rogers cameraman is taking a picture of, who has not slept, as you said, for hours or possibly days. Who is excited, who is hot, who is tired. How do you get that discipline?
Okay. Discipline comes from two things. One, a unit that has the baseline of value norms, that a value system or a creed or something that every soldier, Marine, Airman, whatever, lives by. In other words, it's more important than you yourself, your self-interest. Second, training. Training and training and training. Good training. And no one trains more than an American unit.
I want to pause for just
They're
a
in a
moment.
firefight, I think, yeah.
Walter, if you can, feel free to tell us what's going on.
No fire.
Well, we're still watching that Bradley fighting vehicle turret swing. I should tell you that's not your ordinary Bradley. That's a fire control vehicle. I know the officer on board. I believe it's Lieutenant Wade. And they are swinging that turret constantly because we're in a very harsh and difficult environment for combat or much else here. The sandstorm you've been mentioning greatly limits the visibility for the gunners aboard any of these vehicles, the tanks or the M113s or again the Bradleys. In other words, the Iraqis could be out in those fields and could be crawling up. Here's a time when night vision goggles don't help you, and it's very difficult to see because the sand and the grit is constantly in your eyes. So it's possible for an Iraqi to creep on his belly through these alluvial fields, these agricultural fields, and come within 100 yards of that vehicle, or with perhaps even something as large as a rocket-propelled grenade, which wouldn't do much damage to the Bradleys or the tanks, but any thin-skinned vehicle like the one we're riding in would be in a sorry predicament. Anderson, Carol?
General, you wanted to add something.
Well, I wanted to finish that one comment, question that Anderson brought up because it's extremely important. The discipline in a unit like this, in our coalition forces like British units, and I've trained with the British, they have the same philosophy and discipline. That's not forced discipline. That's ingrained discipline and pride in the unit. Everybody wants to perform to a certain standard. Totally different than the Iraqi army discipline, which is forced by fear from within their own leadership. So here, the discipline is expressed by not only the colonel in charge of this unit, but also the private that may be the driver or the gunner of that Bradley. So the discipline is self-discipline instilled by a sense of pride and training regimen in U.S. and British units. Totally different than the discipline in Iraqi army.
Well, tell us about the discipline within the Iraqi army and why that might break down then.
It will break down. When the chips get down, when you have a situation where you have civilians on the battlefield, when you have uncertainty, when you have the presence of leadership being enforced by the Fedayeen or other Gestapo-type embeds that are forcing these units to do things, as soon as that disappears, they just fall apart.
And I think the comment that a lot of observers have been making over the last several days really has been that we see the difference between the Iraqi army and the Fedayeen fighter, the so-called Fedayeen fighters, or the Ba'ath Party officials who have been sent down, that there's the sense among those fighters, it would seem, that they have no other choice, that they have that their days are numbered, and therefore they might as well fight to the end.
Right, exactly. Some people will not surrender because they know they have no future, because the people that they're suppressing will get them at the end of the war.
I should just very quickly bring in, again, we mentioned that sandstorm that we were told about in Baghdad. We now have that picture up. We're going to show it, I believe, on the left-hand side of the screen. We're staying with Walter Rogers, staying with his picture.
And Walter, as we're looking at these pictures of Baghdad, describe for us again what being in a sandstorm like this is like.
For the uninitiated, it's very difficult to describe. There's dust in your mouth. No matter, it's almost like your eyes run out of liquid to rinse the dirt and grit out of your eyes. You could put on a pair of goggles. We're all using ski goggles, except that within a matter of minutes they fog up, so the goggles become virtually useless. The camera's lens has to be cleaned constantly, and every one of the pieces of armament aboard those tanks will have to be cleaned at the next nearest opportunity, because the sand and grit clog the weapons, particularly the M16 rifles, and also the larger weapons. So it's like a blizzard, except the darn stuff doesn't melt.
Yeah,
Carol?
General Grange is nodding his head in agreement with you.
Yeah,
Add
I just
to
wanted
that.
to say, Walter, and I don't want you to give it too personal of an answer, but I'm sure there's sand in everything.
Well, let's start with the orifices.
No, please, let's not.
All day long.
Oh my.
We use cotton swabs all day long. We have to use the cotton swabs to clear our ears out of dirt and grit. So bad is the dirt and grit in our ears that we can't even get the IFB plug in our ears without often digging it out. Your eyes, as I say, you try so hard to just blink your eyes and wash the sand and grit out of your eyes that it's like running out of windshield wiper fluid on your automobile. You're just bone dry, and then there's nothing you can do. You wish you had eye wash. There's neither time nor place for that here, and I think that's as far as I'll take that answer.
Well, it must be hard to breathe too, Walter.
It is, and you wonder about the long-term damage to the people of the deserts, the nomadic peoples like the Bedouins.
We have
our
to interrupt
driver,
you, Walter.
Paul Jordan is...
Walter, I'm sorry, we have to interrupt you because we have to begin our next hour. You're going to stay with us, though, and continue this. Right now, though, we want to toss to Leon Harris.
Good morning, folks. Yeah, Leon Harris here in the CNN newsroom and watching these fascinating pictures and listening to these reports coming in from Walter, talking about a frontline image there. Here now is just what we're following here this morning. Paul Azan will be up here in just a moment, but first we want to give you what's happening this hour long as we continue to watch these pictures coming in from Walter's location there with the 307th. And as we've been seeing from these pictures, the U.S. Army's 307th Cavalry is crossing, or has crossed, the Euphrates River in central Iraq, and it's advancing north in the the general direction of Baghdad now. And Walter Rogers, who's here in the background right there, is embedded with the cavalry, and he says that U.S. forces are using the cover of a blinding sandstorm to escape Iraqi gunfire. And the Iraqis are using that sandstorm for cover to execute that gunfire as well. Now, coalition aircraft bombarded targets in the key northern city of Mosul for a fourth straight night. Our Ben Wiedemann is about 30 miles east of Mosul, and he described it as the most violent night of bombing he's seen since he's been there. Well, coalition forces have changed their strategy in the key southern city of Basra. British military officials say Allied troops are treating the city now as a legitimate military target, now that Iraqi forces have pulled back into the town, possibly to engage troops in urban warfare inside the city. Allied forces had wanted to avoid any fighting inside that city. Now, after days of fighting for control of Qasr, a British military spokesman says the strategic port city in southern Iraq is now safe and open. He says the first shipment of humanitarian aid could arrive very soon. USA Today is reporting that Saddam Hussein may be in a Baghdad bunker receiving medical treatment. U.S. military and intelligence officials are quoted as saying that they know they hit Saddam and they know he's wounded. On Monday, Saddam addressed the Iraqi people on television for a second time since he was targeted in a missile strike at the start of the war last Wednesday. Some intelligence experts think that the tape may have been made before the attack. Our David Ensor continues to gather information on that. We'll hear from him coming up in our 9 o'clock hour Eastern this morning. Also coming up today, U.S. officials are concerned that Saddam Hussein could be using chemical weapons against Iraqi civilians and then blaming it on the U.S. We'll have more on that for you. And a closer look at the Iraqi leader and his family. We'll talk to someone who was on the inside. Plus, sandstorms across much of southern Iraq might slow the progress of coalition forces. We'll get a weather update. All that and much more is ahead as CNN's coverage of the war in Iraq continues right now.
Good morning, welcome. I'm Paula Zahn. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. As we get started here, we're waiting for a news conference to begin with British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who will be briefing reporters in London. While we wait for him to come to the microphones, we're going to take a look at the headlines this morning. The Army's 307th Cavalry is right now traveling through hostile territory, taking on small arms fire as it makes its way deeper into Iraq. Our own Walter Rogers is with the convoy. He says the 307th is now across the Euphrates River. The troops are driving through a massive sandstorm, which Walter tells us is actually helping to provide cover as the column drives down the road. These vehicles are at the front of the U.S. push, which presumably will eventually lead to Baghdad. The road they're on is literally being secured as they proceed. You'll even see from time to time Iraqi vehicles on the road. That shows you just how active that area is. We'll be keeping an eye on this. But right now, we're going to bring in Bill Hemmer, who is standing by in Kuwait City. Bill, good to see you again.
Hey, Paula, hello. Welcome to Tuesday. Yeah, I think you can. Listen, we've had some weather conditions here as well. They don't appear to be nearly as bad as what we're watching from Walter in south central Iraq, but nonetheless, it's played some havoc with our technical crew on this side of the world, Paula. And oftentimes our signal is lost, but we'll try and hang in there the best we can for you. In the meantime, latest developments now in the current war throughout the region. Let's check them for you. U.S. Marines once again involved in intense fighting for the southern Iraqi city of Nasiriyah. Art Harris of CNN with the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marine Division. Task Force Tarara said he saw 7 Marine vehicles, including tanks, APCs, and Humvees that were what Art termed as lost in the desert there, meaning they were no longer operable. Other reports indicate that thousands of Marines now have secured at least 2 bridges there and are moving forward on the highway north to Baghdad. The U.S. Navy bringing in trained dolphins to look for mines in the waterways around the port city of Qasr. So far, no mines have been found in the water, but several Iraqi boats have been discovered. They've been confiscated. They had more than 100 mines on board. Also, Iraq today appealed to the UN to continue the oil for food program suspended at the start of this war. Iraq's trade minister said his country has plenty of money to buy food and medicine, but said it was now being held up because of the war. Much more on all these, Paula, throughout the morning here. But for now, back to you in New York, and good morning again.
Good morning, Bill. Thanks so much. Developments are coming to us from all over Iraq. We're going to get started with Walt Rogers this morning with the Army's 307th Cavalry on the move toward Baghdad. He joins us now by video phone. Walter, what's the very latest from there?
Paula, the U.S. Army's 3rd Squadron, 7th Cavalry has successfully broken the defense line that the Iraqi regime in Baghdad had established between al-Najaf in the west and all the way along the Euphrates River. A short while ago, that is within the past several hours, the Bone Crusher Troop of the U.S. 7th Cavalry managed to find a bridge that was open. They dashed across the bridge to the north side of the Euphrates. Again, that had been a defense line for Saddam Hussein's soldiers, but they managed to punch across that bridge.
Okay, Walt, we're going to have to come back to you. Let's listen in on what the Prime Minister Tony Blair of Great Britain has to say.
Some of the news. In the 5 days since military action began, a huge amount has already been achieved. It's worth pointing out that the circumstances were completely different. In 1991, there were 5 weeks of bombing before ground troops went in. By yesterday, we'd covered twice as much ground in 5 days as was covered in the whole of the last conflict. Our aim remains, as has been stated, to remove Saddam as the route to disarming Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, so the progress towards Baghdad is of vital strategic importance. Coalition forces are therefore continuing what is effectively a two-pronged advance. US 5 Corps are advancing along the road to Kabbalah. The lead elements have reached Kabbalah. They are opposed by the Republican Guard Medina Division. The Medina Division is now under heavy air attack, although poor weather will hamper this. One Marine Expeditionary Force are then advancing on Al-Qut along 2 converging routes. Al-Qut is defended by the Republican Guard Baghdad Division. In the south, the port of Qazar has been secured by British forces. UK 7 Armoured Division is deployed around Basra. Regime supporters continue to hold key points in the urban areas. British forces are also moving into Az-Zubayr, 10 miles southwest of Basra, in search of pockets of pro-Saddam resistance. Iraq and its security apparatus exists to support the regime of Saddam Hussein. Nobody should be surprised, therefore, that there are parts of the armed forces determined to fight, for they know that when the regime falls, which it will, they will have nowhere to go. Nor should anyone be surprised that until the Iraqi people know for sure that the regime that they despise is on the way out, they will hold back, a point now being made by Iraqi exiles. They've been let down before, when they thought coalition forces were going to remove Saddam. And my message to them today is that this time we will not let you down. Saddam and his regime will be removed. Iraq will have a better future ahead of it. But then there will be resistance all the way to the end of this campaign. It will take time and perseverance and the continuing skill and dedication and professionalism of our armed forces to break it down. But nobody, least of all the forces loyal to Saddam, should be in any doubt that the resistance will be broken down and that the goals of the coalition forces will be met. I would also like to update you, if I may, about the humanitarian situation. When people ask about the humanitarian rescue operation, something that will be required, of course, once our forces have secured Iraq, we should be clear that it is not military action that will create humanitarian catastrophe in Iraq. The humanitarian disaster is here and now. It's happening. It's actually been happening for years. Iraq has left unspent up to $2.3 billion allocated by the UN for humanitarian goods under the Oil for Food program. 60% of Iraqis are dependent on food aid. The mortality rate for under fives in Baghdad is higher than in Mozambique. More than half of Iraqis living in rural areas have no access to safe water. On the latest estimates, up to 400,000 children under the age of 5 in the center and south of Iraq have died over the last 5 years through malnutrition and disease. So in addition to pursuing our military campaign with vigor and determination, we are also determined in the wake of military success to bring humanitarian relief to the people of Iraq. The most important humanitarian priority is to restore the operations of the Oil for Food program. Its scale is massive. It spends some $10 billion a year and is funded by the sale of Iraqi oil. As I was pointing out to you a moment or two ago, virtually all Iraqis receive assistance from it. 16 million, that is out of a population of around about 22 or 23 million, 60 million are totally dependent on it for their daily survival. It provides food, water, fuel, medicine, and other basic requirements, and is organized through some 45,000 local distribution centers that has been controlled by the regime. So we are committed to supporting Kofi Annan in every way possible to get the Oil for Food program up and running again as soon as possible. The coalition will secure conditions in which the UN agencies and others, the NGOs, the medical agencies, can operate efficiently and provide that humanitarian relief. There are huge stockpiles of humanitarian aid in Kuwait ready to be deployed for the benefit of the Iraqi people. The Royal Fleet Auxiliary vessel, Sir Galahad, is loaded with humanitarian aid. It will enter the port of Qasr as soon as it is safe to do so. All that is holding us back at present is the threat of Iraqi mines, and it will take some time before we can make the waters safe for our ship to come in. It is yet one more example of the actions of the Iraqi regime that is making it more difficult for the Iraqi people. In addition, the Royal Engineers have today begun to...
Some of you may find what you're seeing in the right part of your screen extremely disturbing. This is the live shot being fed to us from Walt Rogers, who is riding along with the Army's 37th Cavalry. I would like to provide context. It would appear over the last 30, 40 seconds, these are Iraqi soldiers that have been captured. It's not clear whether they surrendered and then were captured, but that is what the picture is we're looking at now. Back to Prime Minister Tony Blair.
But also the diplomatic implications of recent events for the future, in particular, how we get America and Europe working again together as partners and not as rivals, to assess the best way of dealing with the humanitarian crisis in Iraq that I've just described to you, how we rebuild Iraq post-Saddam, and also, of course, our approach to the Middle East peace process and to the Arab world more generally. But I will also meet Kofi Annan in New York. For whatever the difficulties and differences within the UN in the run-up to military action, I am clear that the United Nations must be centrally involved in dealing both with the humanitarian crisis and in helping Iraq rebuild itself once Saddam is gone. So we will leave after Prime Minister's questions tomorrow, spend tomorrow evening and most of Thursday at Camp David with President Bush, and then see Kofi Annan in New York on Thursday evening before flying home overnight. That is an update on the situation. Right. Questions, thank you. Andrew.
Andrew Marr, BBC News. Prime Minister, the way things look at the moment, you are shortly going to have to take a decision about what to do when coalition forces reach Baghdad, city of 5 million people. Clearly the tactics are to draw British and American forces into that city and engage them in close combat there, with all the huge risks for the civilian population that involves. Are you prepared to order British troops into Baghdad to fight in those circumstances?
I think one of the things you will have to simply be patient about, and forgive me a little on, is if I don't go into details of how we intend to conduct the military campaign from now on in. But be under no doubt at all that obviously the purpose is to remove the regime. To do that, it is important that we go to Baghdad. Coalition forces are now some 50, 60 miles south of Baghdad. Exactly how we will then progress the military campaign after that, I'm afraid, is a matter for us and the military. And I don't think it would be very wise for us to discuss this in public and in open now. But I would simply say to you that all the way through, the important thing has been to push on for Baghdad, having secured both the oil installations in the south and making sure that in the west of the country, we do not allow Saddam to use that as a base for external aggression, and in the north we keep the situation as calm as possible. And I would simply point out that so far, over the 5 days, the progress on the way to Baghdad has been exactly what we planned and anticipated. Adam.
Sky News. Prime Minister, I wonder if I could ask you a bit about the...
As Prime Minister Tony Blair continues to take questions from reporters in one of his monthly press briefings, we call your attention to the right-hand part of the screen. This scene being fed to us from Walt Rogers along with the Army's 7th Cavalry. This is the crew that just breached the Euphrates River, a very important what they're calling success. Now, Walt is not with us right now audio-wise. I can only tell you what we've been seeing for the last 3 minutes or so are scenes like this with what appear to be Iraqi soldiers on the ground. Whether they've been surrendered or have been captured, it is not clear. But we have seen, for folks counting this, up to a dozen of these men now. Back to Tony Blair in Great Britain.
In Iraq over the past few years, only as a result of the British and American pilots policing the no-fly zone, is that the autonomy people have gained in northern Iraq has allowed them to live a far better life. For example, the child mortality rates I was explaining to you. I specifically said we're in the centre and south of Iraq because in the north of Iraq, child mortality has been falling, and has been falling because they've got greater freedom from Saddam. So, without going into the details of what any post-Saddam Iraq might look like at the present time, we would obviously not want to give up the considerable gains that people in the north have made. Secondly, in relation to the UN, I mean, there are two issues here. The first is, in respect of humanitarian assistance, we need a resolution through on that, and I'm confident that we should be able to secure that. There is going to be a debate about the UN resolution that then governs the post-Saddam civil administration in Iraq. We are quite clear that any such administration has to be endorsed by the United Nations. It's important. And that's exactly what we said at the summit in the Azores. Now, the details of that we will discuss with allies within the UN, with others. There may be certain diplomatic difficulties, but I think in the end people will come together and realise that it's important that any post-Saddam Iraqi government has the broadest possible representation, is respectful of human rights, is careful to preserve the territorial integrity of Iraq, and that the important thing after all the diplomatic divisions that there have been is that the international community comes back together. And I hope that it will. Nick.
Prime Minister, up till now you haven't taken the opportunity to warn the British people of a potentially long war with heavy losses. Should they be ready for that? And can I ask you about the Iraqi people too? There's been much talk of liberation. Isn't there a real danger that we're seeing now that many Iraqis regard Western forces as invaders and occupiers?
In respect of the first, we are 5 days into this conflict. Now, part of the issue that happens in the way that war is now covered is that we have constant reports coming back from the front line. We've got 24 hours a day media reporting, and sometimes people can lose sight of the essential strategic picture. That is that we move in the land forces at the same time as any air campaign. We push on towards Baghdad. Within 5 days, we're 60 miles south of Baghdad. We secure the oil installations in the south, which we've done. We make sure that the north is calm, which it is. We make sure that the west is not able to be used as a basis for external aggression, and that is also secure. Now, that is a strategy unfolding exactly according to plan. Of course, there will be tragedies and accidents and things that happen along the way. War is always like that. But the strategy is the strategy that I've described, and it is taking shape exactly as we thought it would. Now, in respect of the Iraqi people, the best, look, you can listen to me, you can listen to others, but the best words on that will come from people who've got some experience of the Iraqi people themselves. And if I could just read to you some words that were spoken by Dr. Hamid al-Saki, from the UK, he was the UK representative of the Supreme Council for Islamic Resistance. He said this, and I think the words that are worth repeating. He said, the population in southern Iraq had a very bad track record of betrayal from the Allies in 1991 and following years. So they will not be willing to go against the regime unless they are sure they are going to have the support. And that is, again, what I think many others have said. that you cannot expect ordinary Iraqi people who've lived for years under the boot of Saddam and who have twice before been let down, I'm afraid, by Allied forces, to be confident that they're able to come out and express their views until they are sure that Saddam's regime is gone. Now, that is what you would expect and anticipate. But one of the other interesting things is just, again, from a source that is not a government source, and to be frank, I'm not sure even what the position of this particular individual is about the military action that we're undertaking. But let me just read you this as well. It's from Dr. Hani El-Banna.
We're going to quickly bring you up to date on what we think you're watching from the right-hand part of the screen. These remarkable pictures being fed to us from Walt Roger and his crew, along with the U.S. Army's 37th Cavalry. They are in the process of having just crossed the Euphrates River as they move north from the southern Iraqi city of Basra. Now, Walt Rogers said there has been a massive sandstorm, which has allowed Iraqi soldiers to move closer to the road than they thought they would be, and limited the use of any kind of air support. We have seen over the last 5 minutes or so what appeared to be over a dozen soldiers like this, Iraqi soldiers on the ground with their legs crossed. It's not clear whether their hands are bound or what, but this is something we've seen repeatedly. Walt Rogers trying to give us context of what they've experienced. The convoy came under heavy fire from rocket-propelled grenade launchers, rifle fire, mortars, machine guns. And Walt said that the Iraqi soldiers are so close to them, quote, "I can hear them in the drainage ditch below us." Back now to Tony Blair in Great Britain.
So this is not something alien to the wishes or spirit of the Iraqi people. I am quite sure, given the chance in freedom to express their wishes, they will not want to live under a military dictatorship. Mother.
Another quote from you. This is a guards officer in Basra yesterday. He said, "We were expecting a lot of hands up from Iraqi soldiers, but it hasn't quite worked out that way. There are significant elements in Basra who are hugely loyal to the regime." Now, doesn't that mean that your strategy needs a rethink, and in fact that coalition forces are in danger of being overstretched?
No, it is precisely what you would expect, that the Iraqi forces that are most loyal to Saddam's regime, I mean, these are the people that have policed the country, gained from the rule of Saddam, been the instruments of repression of the civilian population. These people are going to fight, and that is always what we expected. What we have not seen, however, is the same degree of fighting from the Iraqi regular army. That has melted away. There are prisoners that have been taken, but otherwise it simply has melted away. But you would expect to find resistance from those forces that are very, very close to Saddam, because they know that if Saddam is removed, their power is removed. And that is precisely what we would expect and what we've had. Eleanor, sorry. No, I can just assure you of this. Before we went into this conflict, there was the most careful planning and consideration of the forces that we need, and we have the forces that we need to do the job. Eleanor.
How can you hope to maintain your strategy of minimizing civilian casualties if, when it comes to Baghdad, you have those very people, the people who have most to lose by seeing Saddam go, fighting in the streets? I mean, aren't you inevitably going to get involved into the very scenario that you were trying to avoid?
Well, again, let me say that this scenario is exactly what we would have expected. At some point, the regime was going to come back in, retrench in Baghdad, and all I can assure you of, without going into the details of it, because it wouldn't be sensible to do it, is that this is entirely what was anticipated and what we have provided for in the strategy that we have.
So when you get to Baghdad, you still think you can do it in such a way that you don't alienate the civilian population by destroying infrastructures?
I think that is what we have done throughout, and it is why, for example, that we have done everything we can to protect the infrastructure of services. We've done everything we can to spare the civilian population. Of course there will be civilian casualties. I think they have been far fewer than people anticipated. And the very reason why we wanted to make sure that the land campaign started at the same time, if not slightly predating the air campaign, was in order to demonstrate this is not a situation where we're trying to bomb Iraq into submission. and then send in land forces afterwards. This is a situation in which we're combining land and air in such a way that we try and minimize the suffering to Iraqi people. And I can assure you that the strategy that we have when we get to Baghdad takes account, as I say, of exactly what you would suspect. Because I think, as some people have sometimes described it, in the Iraqi regime, I mean, there are concentric circles that, as they go closer and closer to the regime, you get tougher and tougher pockets of resistance. And those people that have literally based their lives on support for Saddam, I mean, they are going to fight until they know it's hopeless. But they will know it's hopeless. Yes.
Suhair Salman from Egypt. Prime Minister, I wonder if you are considering negotiation with the Arab, because the Arab ministers were meeting yesterday and they asked for stopping the war. Are you going to disregard their opinions?
No, of course we take seriously the comments that are made. And I think part of the reason why it is so important that we demonstrate to the Arab world, one, that we will do everything we can to protect and help people in Iraq, because even if a fraction of those figures I have just given you, not from government sources, about the thousands of people dying needlessly in Iraq is true, then Iraq will benefit from a better, more representative government that takes care of the rights and prosperity of people in Iraq. And secondly, we also have to make sure that we show the even-handedness that I think the Arab world rightly demands by giving priority also to the Middle East peace process. And I simply repeat to you what I've said many times before, that I believe that, more than any love of Saddam, is what concerns and worries people in the Arab world. And I understand that concern. I understand that worry. It's one of the things I will discuss with President Bush when we meet together. And I simply tell you, I know people have been skeptical and cynical about this. I am absolutely determined that we take forward this Middle East peace process, because I believe it to be in the interest, incidentally, not just of the Palestinians, but also of Israel too.
Prime Minister Matt Peacock from Australian Broadcasting. In Basra, as you pointed out, there is a humanitarian problem, and there was one before the war in the sense of people being malnourished and needing drugs, etc. Isn't that problem going to be much worse now, given the lack of water, food and other resources that you say will still be several days? And what do you plan to do about it, given that you're in effective control militarily? And secondly, you've failed to get one UN resolution already. If France and Russia persist with their insistence that this is an illegal war, how dangerous would it be if you failed to get a second one on the post-war Iraq?
Well, the reason I believe it will be different is because it's manifestly in the interest of the UN and the people of Iraq, whatever you think about the military action, the post-Saddam era in Iraq is governed by a UN resolution, and I hope and believe people will appreciate that. In respect to the first point, the International Red Cross and other bodies...
We're going to leave the Prime Minister's news conference a moment to quickly check in with Walt Rogers, who is embedded with the 7th Cavalry. Walt, we've been looking at these pictures. We can't really tell what we're looking at. What has happened in the last 5 minutes or so that we've been broadcasting these live pictures?
The U.S. Army 7th Cavalry has just taken 3 Iraqi prisoners of war. Actually, they're very close, that is to say, no more than 40 yards away. But the dust and sand are blowing so badly, you're getting these vague images. They were captured by the U.S. Army up the road, not very far ahead of us. They were driving a truckload of weapons, and that's when the Army apprehended them. They've had their arms tied. They're lying in the sand now. No evidence of any hostility on their part now, but I should point out that as the 7th Cavalry has moved forward for the past 4 or 5 hours, the cavalry has taken plenty of small arms fire and mortar fire. The Iraqi soldiers, colleagues of the ones you're seeing there, have been shooting at us. I suppose the headline from here this morning is that the U.S. Army's 3rd Squadron 7th Cavalry has broken the Euphrates defense line, which Saddam Hussein and his generals had established established along the Euphrates River in south-central Iraq. That defense line starts probably around Al-Najaf and then follows the flow of the river to Al-Samawa and Nasiriyah, where the Marines are having difficulty, and over to Basra. But the U.S. Army has been able, the cavalry has found an open bridge, has had to fight its way through that bridge, despite the fact that the bridge was heavily laced with explosives. They got there first, and the cavalry was able to push on through, and now they have been pushing northward, despite this sandstorm, into Iraq in the general direction of Baghdad. Paula?
I guess this sends a pretty powerful message to Saddam Hussein about the elite troops that were sent down to block this area.
Good point, Paula, because recall, the U.S. Army originally thought Saddam was going to make his stand with his crack divisions in a ring around Baghdad. There was a bit of a surprise when he sent down his Fedayeen commanders, some of his elite Republican Guard troops, and ensconced them in the cities which I just mentioned along the Euphrates River, and told them these lines must be held. Those are extraordinarily ruthless characters, according to one Army officer with whom I spoke. They were told to stand and fight along that line, and they have put up fairly stiff resistance. They just do not have the firepower, and the problem over the past day and a half or so has been for the Army to figure out how to flank them. The Army colonel in charge of the 7th Cavalry came up with a flanking movement. He moved his soldiers, first Bone Crusher troop of the 7th Cav, and then Apache troop through the hole, over the bridges, and the Army has been moving north ever since, albeit under very, very heavy small arms fire. There have been mortars falling around us for the past hour and a half, although I think the sandstorms even shut down some of the snipers. Paula?
At one point you described that the Iraqi soldiers had moved out so much closer to the road than expected because of the sandstorm that you could actually hear them in the drainage ditch below you.
That's true. We had two extraordinarily close calls last night when the 7th Cavalry was moving towards the canal, which just precedes the Euphrates River crossing. The 7th Cavalry and this CNN camera crew and I ran a gauntlet of fire. There was very heavy light machine gun, heavy machine gun fire. They were firing rocket-propelled grenades at us. A rocket-propelled grenade flew right over the roof of our car. And I was standing outside with my cameraman, Charlie Miller. We were taking picture of the Air Force being called in, the A-10 Warthogs chewing up the ground at night. Nice visual pictures of bombs falling on the Iraqis who had set up this ambush. And in the process, we came under very heavy fire, and suddenly there was a burst of machine gun fire from the tank just ahead of us, probably no more than 30 yards, 20 yards ahead of us. We didn't even see it, but Charlie and I were standing there, and there was this Iraqi soldier creeping forward on his belly in total darkness with a Kalashnikov in his hand. Fortunately, the machine gunner on the tank could see through his night vision goggles this guy crawling along on his belly, and he swung his 7.62 millimeter around very quickly and shot that guy up. But it was quite an engagement. They're figuring they killed 400 at least Iraqi dismounts, that is Iraqi infantrymen, just on the approach to the bridge last night. There's been a lot of firing today, but nothing like the conflict last night on the approach to the Euphrates River bridges when they had to call in the Air Force, they had to call in the big artillery, the 155 millimeter, and we literally ran a gauntlet. The sky was ablaze with tracer fire and bombs and everything. Paula?
While we'll continue to look at these amazing pictures, the 3 Iraqi prisoners, that scene somewhat obscured by all this blowing sand. Give us a sense right now as you stand there, what you can see and how vicious this sandstorm is.
I can see half a football field at most. No more than half a football field from the goal line to midfield. After that, you can't see anything. It's like being in a blizzard, except unfortunately the sand doesn't melt as the snow does. Now, this gives some temporary military advantage to both sides, although the greater military advantage falls to the Iraqis. The American advantage in crossing the Euphrates River Bridge this morning was it was like a smoke screen. The sandstorm was like a smoke screen, and so they couldn't be begin shooting at us very accurately until we were mostly across the bridge, and consequently, under those circumstances, they didn't have a chance to reload, refire, reposition, re-aim, and we were able to roll through. But those mortars were falling very close. As I said, one blast hit so close to me that as I was in the vehicle, that I could hear the shrapnel shards going upward into the date palm fronds above. The real advantage, however, in this sandstorm, of course, falls to the Iraqis. One, it's their indigenous climate, but two, and just as importantly, is it denies visibility to the gunners aboard the Bradley fighting vehicles, denies the machine gunners on the tanks visibility, and it means that these soldiers can literally creep to within 50 or 100 yards of the road, stand off, and the soldiers, the U.S. Army soldiers, cannot see them coming. So the sandstorm, at least short term, works to the advantage of these of the Iraqis, and they have slowed the American advance again because of these inclement weather conditions. Paula?
Well, one final question for you. As we were dipping in and out of the British Prime Minister's news conference, in addition to these men sitting cross-legged on the ground with their arms pulled behind their back, we also appeared to see several other what appear to be Iraqi soldiers on their side. Are there a lot more soldiers than we're talking about here, or was the shot a little bit deceiving?
Neither, Paula. These are the same three soldiers. The Iraqis have just simply been moved from a position before where it was determined that where they were, they might, in the sandstorm, get run over by a civilian vehicle. So the U.S. Army, after having bound their hands with plastic ties, has put them together again. They have two guards, two cavalrymen. They are standing guard over them. We don't know if the POWs speak Arabic or not. Speak English or not. But there appears to be some sort of intercourse going on between one of the U.S. Army guards and the Iraqis. Again, they're waiting to be taken to the rear. The only mistreatment is that which we all suffer, which is to say an abuse of Mother Nature by a sandstorm. Paula?
Well, Rogers, thanks so much. We'll be getting back to you throughout the morning. Walt probably giving us our best idea yet of how the sandstorm is pounding the region. What he said, it's much like being in a blizzard, but unlike a blizzard where the snow melts, the sand simply doesn't go away. Christiane Amanpour is with British forces in northern Kuwait. She joins us now with the very latest from there. Christiane?
Well, Paula, here, because of stiff Iraqi opposition around towns such as Basra, particularly in southern Iraq, the British are having to reconfigure and change their tactics. They are now declaring Basra a legitimate military target, having told us all along since the beginning of this war that it would not be a military target and that they would attempt to bypass it and only go in if they were welcome. They want to bring in humanitarian aid. The latest from the 7th Armoured Brigade, the British brigade around Basra, is that they have been taking fire, they say, from irregular Iraqi forces, those in civilian clothes, perhaps Saddam's Fedayeen or the Ba'ath Party militia, but these people have been coming out of the town with apparently human shields in front of them, according to the British 7th Armoured Brigade, taking shots at the British and then retreating back into the city. That's the latest from what we've heard, but it builds a picture because the Iraqi army that was defending around Basra has moved back into the city. The British at first thought that they had surrendered and melted away, but they've actually gone back into the city, many of them, with tanks, heavy artillery, and with infantry, and they are fighting the British from inside the city, which means the British are going to have to take them on in the city, although they don't want to do that because of the collateral civilian damage that they don't want to cause, so they're hoping to be able to contain that to the outskirts of the city. In the meantime, one of the prime objectives is the humanitarian aid, and they say now that the port of Qasr, which has been insecure for quite a long time in terms of pockets of resistance, is now finally secured. This according to US and British military officials, and they hope to be able to bring in aid as soon as possible via that port, the only commercial port in Iraq. In the meantime, a lot of humanitarian aid has been stacked up inside Kuwait, ready to be rolled in, if necessary, by vehicle, by road. But what they're finding is a lot more Iraqi resistance than they had expected, particularly around Basra. Paula?
I want to talk a little bit more about that quickly, because the British Prime Minister said although he was pleased with the huge amount that has already been achieved, he made it very clear in his briefing that he just said that there will be resistance like you're talking about until the very end of the campaign. And he said the campaign will take time. It will take perseverance. Are you being given any context as to what kind of time period we're talking about here?
No, they won't give us a timeline, but I think one has to really accept that neither the British officials nor the military expected this kind of resistance. So although they're saying, yes, it's going to be difficult, it's because they're reacting now to facts on the ground and they're changing tactics and maneuvers accordingly. They did not expect to have this amount of resistance, A, from the so-called irregulars, the Saddam Fedayeen that we've been talking about, those special militias that were created by the regime to control internal, to enforce internal repression and to control internal dissent. Those people have been put into these cities and are fighting from inside those cities, plus these huge numbers of troops that originally were thought to have surrendered have moved back into the cities. All of this paints a picture that the British, and in some instances on their way the Americans, did not expect, and so they're having to react on the ground accordingly. The problem in the British sector I can talk about is that this now becomes, according to the British officials here, a high-risk and difficult military operation. You know, they had hoped to go in on their terms. Now the Iraqi resistance is forcing them to fight perhaps on Iraq's terms. Iraq wants to pull them into the cities, wants to draw them into street fighting, wants to make it a quagmire, knows that the coalition forces do not want to fight street to street, nor do they want to cause civilian casualties. So the Iraqis are trying to change the balance of power, and the British are going to have to react to that and to try to neutralize them without causing civilian damage. And as I say, difficult and high risk. Paula?
Christiane Amanpour, thanks so much. As Christiane talked about the kind of resistance that coalition forces are being met with, it's interesting to note that the British Prime Minister says he sees no threat of coalition forces being overstretched. It's also interesting to note, Bill, that the Prime Minister downplayed the kind of resistance that's being encountered. And in two different parts in the news conference, he made two specific references. One saying it is taking shape as we thought it would. The second time, this scenario is what we had expected. That's the latest footnote from Tony Blair's news conference. Back to you now, Bill.
All right, Paul, the other thing you talked about was that two-pronged approach, one from the southeast of Baghdad and one from the southwest of Baghdad. That southwest location where it's largely believed this Medina division of the Republican Guard on behalf of Iraq is now positioned. They have a storied history within the Iraqi military going back over the past 20 years, said to be very formidable, perhaps the most well-equipped of any Republican Guard division. Ken Pollack knows that all too well. He's the author of The Threatening Storm, the case against Saddam Hussein, also from the Saban Center in Washington, D.C., back with us here on American Morning. Ken, welcome back. Tell us why the Medina is considered to be the best, if not one of the best, probably the best division within the Republican Guard.
Well, Bill, the Medina is one of the two oldest of Iraq's Republican Guard armored divisions, it and the Hammurabi Division, which is located northwest of Baghdad right now. Those are probably the two best divisions in Iraq. They've got a very long history, as you pointed out. They were formed in about 1986. They fought in all of the major battles at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. They were the ones who bore the brunt of the fighting when the Iranians attacked Basra in 1987. They were the ones who bore the brunt of the fighting when the Iraqi army defeated the Iranians. They were the ones who led the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And it's important to note that in 1991, U.S. military personnel going up against the Republican Guard. We fought the Medina Division in a battle that was called the Battle of Medina Ridge, when our 1st Armored Division went up against a brigade of the same 2nd Brigade of the Medina Division that Walt Rogers' 7th Cavalry Regiment is going up against right now. Fought them in a battle all afternoon long, and American personnel taking part in that, combat veterans from Vietnam, all said that it was the toughest firefight that they had ever encountered. It was harder than anything they ever fought in Vietnam because the Republican Guards, even though they weren't very good soldiers, would not stop. They wouldn't stop fighting. U.S. forces would blow up their armored personnel carrier, and you'd have 2 or 3 charred Iraqis fall out of the back of it and start firing at the U.S. tanks with machine guns, RPGs, whatever they could.
Yeah, now, Ken, listen, there are a lot of different factors today as opposed to 1991. That was wide open desert. We are told now heavily vegetated area southwest of Baghdad. We're also told, based on some reports, that perhaps they're using the same tactics the Serbs used in Kosovo. In other words, putting their tanks, their 272 tanks, underneath individual trees, hiding them out in storage areas as well. When you consider those factors right now, and also think of the history of this fighting force, what do you do right now from a military strategy in order to take this unit on?
Well, I think that what the U.S. is doing right now is probably the best thing. First, we're in the middle of a sandstorm, so that's going to make it very difficult. In a sandstorm, it reduces our advantages even further. Our great advantages over the Republican Guard are our maneuverability and our long-range fire, which they don't have either of those two things. The sandstorm takes both of those things away from us. So the best thing to do is to wait out the sandstorm and then try to soften up the Medina as best we can using air power, artillery, and helicopters, and then go in fully with a combined arms team, infantry, armor, artillery, helicopters, and air. What we found time and again is that the Iraqis cannot handle that kind of a full burnt of force. They're very good in these kind of little fights where they can dig themselves in and take pot shots at U.S. forces. They're tenacious defenders, but when we can put together a combined arms force that forces them to react in ways that they didn't plan to before, when we can start flanking them, and that'll be another important element, that's when the Republican Guards do worst.
Ken, we're already hearing from the Pentagon this could be one of the key battles, if not the key battle today. Tell us why.
Well, as I said, the Medina is one of the best divisions in the Iraqi armed forces. And the expectation is, the hope is, that if the U.S. can just crack the Medina wide open and just cause it to fall apart, that this will send a very powerful signal to other Republican Guard divisions, that it's simply not worth resisting U.S. forces. If they see the Medina overrun easily by U.S. forces in a day or so, that will say to the rest of them, hopefully, that fighting the Americans just isn't worth it, and hopefully that'll cause the rest of the Republican Guard defenses around Baghdad to start to crumble.
All right, Ken Pollack, author of The Threatening Storms, the Bond Center in Washington, D.C. One other footnote on this, Ken, we'll talk to you later today. Said to be Medina, comprised of about 10,000 troops, possibly 250 tanks, possibly 250 armored personnel carriers, but certainly this is something right now the Pentagon's trying to get a much better view at from the air, but obviously quite difficult today given the weather conditions here throughout the Persian Gulf. More in a moment. Paul again in New York.
And Bill, as you know, late yesterday, the Pentagon confirming that the 2 Apache helicopter pilots whose craft went down in Iraq are now prisoners of war. We're going to take a short break. When we return, I'll be talking with the family of one of those men. We'll be right back.
How old do you have to be to run away from home? 8, 68, somewhere in between? What would you take with you? And where would you go if you could go anywhere? We have a lot of places to explore out there, the kind of places that require a map and a friend. There are over 4 million miles of roads in Alamo country, and with values like this, they're easy to explore. Alamo, the official rental car of the American vacation.
Think all mortgage lenders are the same? Think again. At Ditech.com, there are 2 fast and easy ways to apply for a second mortgage 24 hours, 7 days a week. You can pick up the telephone and call our toll-free number or apply online at Ditech.com. Right now, you can apply for a second mortgage with Ditech's no closing cost option. Use the money to pay off credit card debt, whatever you want. Ditech.com. There is a difference. Call 1-800-71-FIXED.
Smart Balance Buttery Spreads, judged the best tasting in the soft vegetable spread category by the American Tasting Institute, helps to improve the ratio of good to bad cholesterol with no trans fatty acids and no hydrogenated oil. Use delicious Smart Balance Buttery Spreads.
Back here live in Kuwait City, military planners will tell you that Mother Nature is neutral. If it's rainy and windy for one side, it's rainy and windy for the other. And certainly Mother Nature is a story, at least today anyway, and possibly going into tomorrow on Wednesday. As we look back now on the past 24 hours, in addition to the weather, Renee San Miguel now has a look at the most significant developments right now in the war in Iraq.
Recapping developments in the past few hours. 7:27 p.m. Monday, 3:27 a.m. in Iraq. CNN's Frank Buckley on board the USS Constellation reports that coalition aircraft are targeting Saddam International Airport near Baghdad. 8:52 p.m. CNN's Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon confirms that the U.S. has destroyed the Apache helicopter that landed in Karbala, Iraq yesterday. The 2 American pilots were taken prisoner by Iraq. 12:05 a.m. Ben Wiedemann reports a 4th night of heavy bombing in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. 12:30 a.m. Gary Stryker on board the USS Roosevelt reports planes from that carrier will switch away from massive bombing to focus on hitting targets of opportunity and providing air support for ground troops. 1:04 a.m. CNN's Art Harris, traveling with the 2nd Marine Division, reports heavy fighting for a 3rd day in the southern Iraqi city of Nasiriyah. 1:25 a.m. CNN's Christian Amanpour reports that the city of Basra is now considered a legitimate military target, according to British military officials. They tell her the hope is to wear down Iraqi forces in the city and facilitate getting humanitarian aid to civilians there. 3:38 a.m. Darren Kagan reports from Kuwait that relief agencies there are shipping food to Iraq, which will be shipped in as quickly as possible.
Renee San Miguel again with the latest developments that we have all witnessed over the past several hours. One more at this hour. The air raid sirens are back here in Kuwait. Second time that we've had this in the past 15 hours. An Iraqi missile was fired into Kuwaiti airspace earlier today here in Kuwait, knocked out of the sky by yet again another Patriot missile battery. What comes of this one, we're not quite certain just yet, but we'll let you know when we get that word. Now, Paula in New York.
Bill, I always worry when you say that. You don't seem to be seeking any kind of cover there. There's an elaborate system you have worked out about these alarms. I know you get a lot of these alarms, and then the all clear is sounded. Where are you right now?
We are in our hotel, is essentially where we've set up shop here, our 60 colleagues working on behalf of CNN, and there's a group of us who make our decision based on our own personal knowledge of the situation around us to either get off the air and go down the parking garage or stay on the air. But, you know, Paula, throughout this entire ordeal, I've tried to stress that all of these missiles that have entered Kuwaiti airspace have all landed well out in the desert, largely aimed at the military positions on behalf of the U.S. and the British. And as I say that, Paula, there's the all clear. So again, that follows the pattern again that we have heard and seen now for the past 7 days running. More in a moment.
You certainly have had dozens of these since you've been there. That must be a pretty darn good sign when you finally hear that all clear sign, right?
Yeah, certainly it is, Paula. It is quite reassuring to us, and I can tell you we're not taking any chances. So if indeed we feel like we should take cover, we will. But to date so far, no threats here in the city of Kuwait, and that's a good thing.
Happy to hear that. Thanks, Bill. See you in a little bit. Sure. They didn't say a word and appeared to be unharmed, but the fate of 2 U.S. Apache helicopter pilots who were captured in Iraq after their helicopter went down is anything but certain. Chief Warrant Officer Ronald Young, seen on the left and video played on Al Jazeera TV, is from Georgia. And joining us now from there in Lithia Springs, his parents, Ronald and Kay Young, sisters Kelly and Lively and Samantha Jarrow, and his brother Mark Young, his wife Stephanie, and Ronald's other brother Jesse Young. Nice to have you all with us this morning. Sorry it has to be at such a traumatic time for your family. Mrs. Young, explain to us what the military has told you about your son and his condition.
You probably know as much about that as I do, just that he is a POW. And that, you know, he looks good. He looks like he hasn't been harmed, and we're very thankful for that. And that's pretty much all we know. They said that they've given us numbers. We can call them if we have questions, and they would let us know just as soon as they knew anything. They've been wonderful.
But like any mother, I'm told you have that mother's intuition, and even though you say your son looks okay, there was some sort of signal you got that things weren't going well for him. Explain to us what happened.
I just, I had been worried about him all day. And they had the 3-hour conflict. And after that, I just had this feeling, I don't know. And it was so dramatic that I looked at the clock and I think that's probably about the time they went down. I'm not sure about that, but I just felt like I was just embraced, and I just felt like I was, I felt safe and I felt warm all over, and I just felt like that he was all right. And then when I heard it went down at, when I woke up at 5:15 and I saw the helicopter, I wondered if that feeling, you know, immediately came back to me, and I was afraid he was dead. But, you know, now I know that that was just a mother's feeling, and the Spirit allowed us to, I guess, almost touch souls or something. I don't know, but it's been very comforting.
Yeah, I think over time, everybody has learned never to second guess the instincts of a mom. Mr. Young, tell me about when it was confirmed to your family that in fact your son had been taken a prisoner of war.
Well, we found out about the situation, you know, over the radio, and then my wife called the company commander's wife out there in Texas, and she said that they would notify us, but they would probably come by the house. It wouldn't be anything like a phone call or anything like that. And I went to take care of some errands during the morning, and I'd been hoping all morning that it wasn't his aircraft. Of course, we had 1 out of 6 chances because there were 6 vampires in that unit. And when I came home, one of the friends of my son said that the Army's in there, so I knew right then that you know, it was a bad situation. And they told us that he was missing in action. They didn't say he was POW or anything, he was just missing.
And then how long was it then that it took to find out that in fact he had been taken as a POW?
Well, that afternoon we'd been hearing rumors that they had captured the pilots, and you know, back and forth on the television. And at one time they said, one of the rumors said that they had a couple of pictures of pilots who had dog tags from that area where he's from, but they didn't have any real clear-cut pictures, so I didn't know if it was something trumped up and they had done something to him, and they were trying to pass someone else off as them, or if they were still uncaptured or what. And I was worried about him just being alive at that point. And a lady brought a tape into us, and Susan Candiotti brought a tape into us and showed us a picture of him as being a POW, and it was a great deal of relief at that point to me just to know he was alive.
Wow. You know, it's hard for us, the rest of us, to respond that, knowing it was a relief that he was alive. You had so many doubts about that. Mrs. Young, I think folks probably know out there the Apache is one of the most sophisticated helicopters in the world, and your son knew before going into Iraq that he probably would be involved in a dangerous mission. Did he ever talk about the possibility of what might happen once he was deployed?
We did. He actually had orders for Afghanistan after 9/11, and then they canceled the orders. And we then had a night that we just embraced and cried and shared feelings, and it just really touched my heart, and I'm glad for that. And then when this time we just decided, we'd already talked about that, and you know, of course we talked about many things, and you know, we're very close. All my children are very close, and I know that he was prepared for something to happen. He had told me that if he was ever asked to give his life for his country, that he hoped he'd be able to do that honorably, and he seemed very glad to do that if that was needed. He supports our president, and he feels like that he's a great leader, and you know, he's just ready to do whatever he's asked to do.
Well, we really appreciate your sharing some of your time with us this morning at this very difficult time. I can see you find that embrace of your family very comforting, and we appreciate the whole extended family joining us this morning as well. Our thoughts are with your family, and if everything you say about the strength of your son is true, we all feel the same way you do. We're very proud of his service and wish him the very, very best. Thank you again for joining us this morning.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
And coming up in the 11 a.m. Eastern hour, we will be talking with the wife of pilot David Williams, who is also being held as a prisoner of war. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
The war in Iraq continues, and no one takes you closer than CNN, live throughout the day. Stay with CNN, the most trusted name in news.
Maybe I didn't love
When Anne Murray sings a classic country song, it's unforgettable.
I fall.
Presenting Anne Murray, Country Croonin'.
I can't stop loving.
30 timeless country classics.
Put your sweet lips a little closer.
These are Anne's favorite classic country songs.
Are you lonesome tonight?
Get Anne Murray, Country Croonin' on 2 CDs or cassettes.
Make the world go away.
You'll treasure this collection forever.
I bless the day I found you.
Please call now.
Call 1-800-306-5300 to order Anne Murray on 2 CDs or 2 cassettes for just $24.99 plus shipping. Or send check or money order to the address on your screen. Call now.
CNN, the most trusted name in news.
Leon Harris here at the CNN Center in Atlanta. Here now is a look at what is happening at this hour. British Prime Minister Tony Blair says the resistance that coalition forces have been facing will soon be broken down and Saddam Hussein will be removed from power. At a news conference this morning, Blair accused the Iraqi regime of intentionally creating a humanitarian disaster in the country. A significant development to report now in central Iraq, as Walter Rogers has been showing us throughout the morning. The U.S. Army's 37th Cavalry crossed the Euphrates River this morning, and they are advancing north in the general direction of Baghdad even as we speak. A senior officer tells Walter that this will considerably weaken Iraq's grip on southern Iraq. And there is word that U.S. forces could be facing new dangers as they approach Baghdad. U.S. intelligence reports suggest that Iraq may have ordered its elite Republican Guard unit to use chemical weapons against advancing U.S. forces if they cross what has been referred to as a red line drawn around Baghdad. Now, where exactly that line is and whether the attack has actually been ordered is far from certain. And what about Saddam Hussein himself? USA Today is reporting that Saddam may be in a Baghdad bunker receiving medical treatment, and that the paper is also quoting U.S. military and intelligence officials are saying they know they hit Saddam and they know that he was wounded in a missile attack last week. Yesterday, Iraqi television aired an address from Saddam, and some intelligence experts think that that tape may have been made before the attack last Wednesday. Our David Ensor is continuing to check up on this story, and we'll hear from him coming up in our 9 o'clock hour Eastern, so stay tuned. Now, the drive toward Baghdad is being slowed by Mother Nature in the form of a blinding desert sandstorm. As we said about our Walter Rogers traveling with the Army's 37th Cavalry this morning as he crossed the Euphrates River on the road to the capital. A sandstorm actually helped them escape Iraqi gunfire. However, it also, according to Walter, has helped Iraqi foot soldiers to escape detection as well, one of them coming within 20 feet or so of Walter before he was shot. The trooper, that is, not Walter. Now, the U.S. Navy is bringing in dolphins. That's right, dolphins, to search for mines off Iraq's strategic port city Qasr. These dolphins are trained to find floating mines and mark them for inspectors. Coming up, U.S. and British forces get some backup. Australian and Polish forces join the fight in Iraq, and we'll have more on that coming up for you.